Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all of y'all. This morning we are on chapter 3 of the book. If anybody does not have a book, please let us know. I can get you one. If you know someone you want to take one to, I can get you one. If one needs to be delivered, we can get that done as well. If you need masks, Jan is sampling the Peacefully Simply Together mask and is sampling the For Your Neighbor's Good mask.
Okay.
And there's a Speak Peace mask as well. And we have those in the office and can get those to you as well. Janice is back this week after being gone on vacation, so if you have sent emails and not heard a reply, that is why. I mean, I've tried to deal with what I could, but she'll deal with the rest when she gets back. These studies are being recorded and put on the YouTube channel. You can also get to them with one click on your e-newsletter. You can also get to them with one click on the website. And Ann Kirshner does that work for us, and she's putting those in order. So you can watch them out of order, I suspect, but you can also watch them in order. If you are not getting that e-newsletter, let us know, because that means something's not correct with your email address that we're sending to. If you know somebody that would like to get that and they are not, let us know, and we will get that done. The sermons are a match. We're trying, Jerry and I are trying to make those match to where we're headed in the book. And so it's a 5 Sunday, because it's 5 chapters. We're doing those 5 chapters. Then the rest of the book is kind of samples of what he's talking about in those 5 chapters. So then on that 6th Sunday, which will be Labor Day weekend, we will do a wrap-up, not here. We are not meeting here. And your class is not meeting that weekend either, Philo Artisan. So on Labor Day weekend, no Sunday school, but the service that morning will be a recap of this information, plus a challenge for September of a couple of things you might want to take on and try. We are practicing putting our chairs away in the right way because the college starts in our building on Tuesday. So when you pick up your chair and put it away, go in this door, put it on that side of the hallway, lean it against either side of the wall, and come out that door. And you may, Kendra, you're doing prayer time and exercise afterwards. So if you're staying with Kendra, great. If you're going home to watch worship at 10:15, great. If you want to stay with Kendra and watch worship later, great. You can do any of those. But if you are not staying for prayer time and you want to go visit, please take your visiting down the sidewalk somewhere so the prayer group can meet afterwards. That would be helpful. Books, anybody needing books, let us know about that. We are all out of the anti-racism books, but people are finishing those books and willing to share. So if somebody else needs a copy, we'll pass one on that's been a pre-read copy. When you're finished with those, you may pass them to a friend, a neighbor, this book as well, or you may turn them back into the church, and then we will let other churches use those that may not have the resources that we have to be able to purchase. So that's what we'll do there. No rain today, just loud birds, so we're good. Charlotte?
Great. And since we got rained out last week and didn't have a chance to discuss chapter 2, I've tried to design my presentation a little shorter today, so hopefully we have plenty of time for questions and comments for both chapter 2 and today's chapter. As Kathryn said, we're talking about separateness and closeness today. Family systems therapists also describe this as individuality versus togetherness, same thing. System theory postulates that we have these 2 basic needs, to both be separate and to be close. The separateness is related to personal, just ourselves. The closeness is related to need for relationships. Page 32, there's a quote I like. It says, "We exist to be distinct from others, but not distant from them." So the goal is to balance the two opposing poles. The greater the balance, the greater the level of self-differentiation. And again, the reason we keep going back to this term differentiation, the more differentiated a person is, typically the better they handle anxiety. They're less likely to anxiously and impulsively react to situations. When we're anxious, we're more likely to be pulled to extremes of either emotional distance or emotional fusion. There have been times when I've worked with couples in therapy that I've talked about my hands as two different people. And the more differentiated we are, the more freedom we have to move close or to be a little more distant, depending upon what the situation calls for. But for people who are highly anxious or less differentiated, you see these extremes of either being very distant, sometimes cut off, or being fused. It's kind of like you don't know where one person stops and the next person starts. Another quote that's in this chapter, people who have a good sense of separateness are able to enjoy their closeness more. There's a chart on page 35 in this chapter that I would encourage you to look at that talks about kind of different behaviors associated with separateness and closeness and kind of lists out those things related to level of differentiation, basically. For the Bible story, to emphasize separateness and closeness, and Kathryn is preaching on this, or has already preached on it, for today, I'm going to read Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 51. Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he had said. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. Now, obviously, this passage has more theological significance than to talk specifically about separateness and closeness. But I think that this is an example where, on one hand, Jesus was following his individual call, yet on the other hand, he was being obedient to his parents. For the Church of the Brethren history example, I want to broaden the notion of separateness and closeness to look at how groups can manage their own sense of distinctiveness within larger systems. And in this case, how the Brethren stayed separate enough to define themselves as a group. So I'm going to talk about Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who some of you, if you've had Brethren history, have probably heard of. He was the leader of the Moravian Protestant Church, and Moravia at the time was kind of part of what became Czechoslovakia and part of Austria. He came to America in December of 1741, and his goal, he had two goals. One was to bring Christianity to the Native Americans, and he also had the vision of uniting all German-speaking Protestant groups in North America, kind of uniting them under one umbrella. And he organized a total of 7 synods in 1742. The first one was on New Year's Day. The early brethren had interest, and there were some brethren who attended the first 3 synods, as did some Mennonites in the area. But then both groups withdrew after the 3rd synod. And the brethren withdrew for 2 reasons. One was they thought the count was kind of controlling, and the second was, in that 3rd synod, they baptized 3 Native Americans by sprinkling. And that just did the brethren in, the sprinkling. And so they withdrew. But following that 3rd synod in late spring of 1742, the brethren organized their own General Assembly to unite their group from within. And this laid the foundation for annual conference. I would argue that the brethren response to the Zinzendorf synods was really one of the most singular formative events in shaping the identity of the early brethren in America. Now, how the balance of separateness and closeness have played out within annual conference itself over the years would be a topic for a whole nother series. As an aside, the Zinzendorf synods also impacted the Mennonites in terms of thinking about their distinctive heritage. And it was in 1742 that they did a couple different things to really establish their distinctiveness with their history of martyrdom. And one was they published a new version of the Ausbund, which was their hymnal, but it had martyr stories in it. And it was also in 1742 that the Mennonites decided to print the Martyr's Mirror in German for the first time. And that was done, for those of you who know Brethren history, at the Ephrata cloister. So, anyway, what about forced separateness that has been a result of COVID-19? Because I think that really deserves mention here. And I came across an article, and I have it with me if anybody's interested in borrowing it, that is in press on the neurobiology of social distance. It's in press in the Trends in Cognitive Sciences journal, and one of the authors is the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, who has published a lot of very interesting stuff. Let's just say it that way. As we know, social isolation can cause loneliness. Not everybody who is socially isolated, though, is lonely. And you have people who, by all outward appearances, look like they have a lot of support, a lot of social support. But they may still perceive themselves as lonely. And it's really the perception of loneliness that is the key here. And I'll be talking some about the fallout one can experience from being lonely. To give an example, though, again, when you think about people who look isolated, they're not necessarily lonely. Stan, one of his really good friends, is a confirmed bachelor, lives in a big house with his 2 dogs, and is happy as a clam. He jokes about wanting to develop bachelor chow that he could market for humans to eat, like dogs eat dog chow. And if he does that, then he's good to go. So but he is not lonely. Loneliness has far-reaching psychological and physiological consequences. Typically, the tighter the friendship network, the less likely you are to get sick, the faster you get better if you're sick, the quicker you recover from surgery, and the longer you live. The research is really striking on loneliness. It's a big deal. In this article, they did talk a little bit about the benefit of other types of social interaction, given the fact that we're all socially distancing now. And some research would suggest that being able to connect with people virtually is not bad. I mean, we still get something from that. It's far better than simple phone contact. Another thing that I find very interesting that these authors postulate is that feelings of loneliness can spread through social networks, causing negativity and skewed social perception. You look at what's happening in our country today, you look at the rise of the QAnon, I wonder how much of, it's hard to know how much of that is specifically related to COVID-19, but there's some pretty crazy ideas out there these days, and I think it really fits with this research. I want to talk a little bit about kind of a system or a circuit in our brain called the default mode network and the implications of loneliness on the default mode network. This is a circuit that's primarily in the neocortex, but there are neuronal links to other parts of our brain. This network is active in wakeful rest, when we're daydreaming, our mind's wandering, when our minds are not basically primarily task focused. This network involves thinking about oneself, thinking about others, remembering the past, and thinking about the future. Some have called this particular circuit of brain cells kind of the neurological basis of self. Loneliness, it's been shown, impacts those connections, those neuronal connections between the limbic system and the default mode network, and within the default mode network itself. And if you think about last week's discussion about the triune brain, another way of conceptualizing this is that loneliness actually weakens those connections from our thinking cap to lower brain regions. So it really has significant implications. Creativity strengthens those neuronal links, but it's really hard to be creative and imaginative and anxious at the same time. One thing I hope that you're hearing as we talk about this week after week is this general theme that right now, with all the anxiety of the COVID-19 epidemic, now more than ever, we need to give ourselves and one another grace. But it's harder to do that right now. But we need to be aware of that and keep trying. Some other interesting research I came across on problems with social isolation. Certain social activities release endorphins, which are those hormones that make us happy and can have an analgesic effect. And those activities, and this is also Robin Dunbar's work, by the way. He does a lot with this kind of thing. Are feasting feasting together, laughing, dancing, and singing. Those are all things that are pretty hard to do right now. There is some very interesting research they've done specifically related to singing and comparing it with some of these other social activities. They've compared the endorphin release with these activities and have found that singing in particular promotes fast social bonding. Now, I think about the implications for when we're all able to be together again safely. And I'm not on the worship committee, so this is not my call to make. But you could argue that what we need to do the first Sunday is sing together for an hour and a half, you know, just sing. That is all I have. What questions or comments do you have either from last week's material or from today? Kathryn, I don't know if you want to start with some things to kind of
I just
steer
want
us?
to confirm that I am happy to scan that article and pop it to all your emails, and then you can delete it or you can read it. Is that okay? Anybody? Okay.
Okay, great.
Could you make a connection for me from last week's discussion about the peace stand and the phases of anxiety?
Oh, you're talking about, was that last week or the week before? The evolution of the peace stance? Are you talking about the Goshen statement?
Talked about the Goshen statement.
Specifically about the Goshen statement,
and
yes.
related to military service in World War I.
Yeah, well, and the point I wanted to make about that was kind of an example, I think, of the people who made the decision to withdraw the Goshen statement as not acting primarily from their thinking cap, that they were so anxious about the implications for them of monetary fine and imprisonment, which anybody would be anxious about those implications, but it led you could argue it led the entire church in maybe a little different direction, given how strong their peace stance had been prior to that. So I think anxiety played into it. They didn't stick to their principles. And again, it was a tough situation, but it's kind of
The chart on page 35, I had trouble understanding it. I get the idea, but how do you read this? Could you just take, let's do, I'll just do the first line.
okay. Well, and so again, if you think back about hands, yeah. So the first column, is cutting off. The second column, I can't remember how they're labeled, defining self, would be closer together, touching others, or clutching others. So really it's the two center columns that are kind of more ideal, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Okay, okay. That helps.
Yeah.
So the first column and the last column are the extremes.
Yes.
Okay.
But and then as you read it across, so when you think about cutting off from people, that's pretty reactive. That's an anxious, reactive response. Now that may be different than situations where people, after much thought and consultation with others, for some reason or another, feel they're in a toxic enough situation that they do need to remove themselves. But here they're talking about more of just a kind of a quick reactive response versus someone who is defining self is going to be more intentional with their interactions with people in terms of ability to touch others. That requires some spontaneity. And again, at the end of touching others, that's related to an anxious, reactive need. So you can read these columns, yeah, you can read them going down and then also read rows across.
Charlotte? In our church, we have people who are lonely. Some we know about and others many we do not know about. As a caregiver or as a church member, how do we respond? How do we find out? How aggressive should we be, can't we be to deal with that as a caregiver or as a church member?
I think when we reach out to, whether you're a caregiver or just a general member of the church family, when you reach out to people, you ask them if they're lonely. Again, you think about some people who are alone and might appear socially isolated to me, are not necessarily lonely. And I just think it's important to ask the question, because then even for those folks that appear connected, to just ask, are you lonely right now?
None of your business.
Well, and if they say that, I guess that's the way it is.
And because our,
Which also says something. Go ahead.
maybe just that they're clear, but also giving space for, because when I use the term lonely, that might mean something different to Wileen than it does to me. So opening the door to redefine that one word. You know, if I say, are you lonely, Ellie? Well, that might mean something different to you. Okay, that is the 60 diesel truck I counted this morning. It must be the thing for college students to have diesel trucks. But just giving the space to let them define, because my lonely is different than your lonely is different than that word might have a different definition.
And my first response when I fall down and somebody says, are you hurt? I say, oh no, I'm fine.
Right, right.
So if you say, are you lonely? Oh no, I'm fine, does not mean, oh no, I'm fine.
Right,
Well,
right, right.
Charlotte, I assume there's situational loneliness right now due to the people that normally would not be classified as lonely people at all. But when the veil lifts, and these 20, 30, 40 people who have been situationally lonely, what do we do then? How do we, is this going to be a big time for ministry, or?
that is a really good question. What do you think?
I just asked the question.
She's good at that.
I'm thinking.
Who knows? I think how it's going to look. We see in the news there's the rise of mental health issues, anxiety and depression right now. I was just reading an article that the percent of college students who are having suicidal thoughts, these are definitely really tough, tough times in terms of mental health.
Is there resilience? People who are normally resilient,
Yeah.
does that just automatically put them back on a normal path, or do we have to do some therapy here? Or
I think it's going to depend on the person.
Well, and what I've been reading too is about those people who, so you've got the crowd who's lonely and isolated and wouldn't normally do that. Then you've got the crowd who might choose that, but because of their job, they can't. So they've been in hyper mode of having to extend themselves when they normally wouldn't do that. So you're also going to have fallout when the veil is lifted of the crowd who is like, leave me alone. I have done 2 years of what I normally wouldn't do. And so you're going to have, I've read articles about extreme reactions. People who need people are going to glob, and people who've had it with people are going to completely retract. And for the younger crowd, what's really insidious right now is the loss of hope. So there was a great article, just read it in this context, that came out, I think it's posted on the KWCH website anyway. It's not just exclusive to them, but they did some interviewing of college students who are losing their football season, their soccer season, their volleyball season, and just wow, like they're having to shift their entire brains about, I always thought I'd go to college and I'd go on a scholarship and I'd have my teammates and I'd be on I'd be traveling. And so, yes, they can still take classes, but that's just not their picture of their life. Kids who have graduated and have no jobs and they're living at home again. So for that, yeah, that 17 to 25-year-old crowd, they're depressed. The hope, and then just what's going on in the country, and they're looking to adults, and adults are lost, and it's hard right now for that age person. Yeah, lots of thoughts of what is the point, suicide. Yeah.
And I think if you add to that the black children who have kind of a double whammy, where they're dealing with the Black Lives Matter and all of this violence towards black people that they see on the news and on social media over and over and over and over and over, and then the COVID vote. So they're losing a lot of their social identity, because when your task as a teenager is to develop your own place in your social community. That's your task, and they're not doing that, and it's a drive. So I really feel for black young people, and I have too read that they're really feeling suicidal.
And the Latinx population, the anxiety is rising because we don't know what's going to happen with the election. So depending on what happens with the election in November, a lot of doors open or shut for the Latinx population in the United States as well. So it's just, yeah, lots of anxiety.
Kendra, you had something.
I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question. And I will preface this with, I've been following the recordings, but I haven't yet read the book, so I don't know what's said or not said about the use of practice in terms of silence. As we start talking about all of these things that are going on in our heads, and the emotions and the anxiety and all of that, I'm wondering what may or may not be said in this kind of a community as well as religious community about the importance of practice. I look back to Richard Rohr and contemplation, as well as in other traditions, meditation, and coming back to the present moment. I mean, I'm hearing talk about the past and the present and all of that, and the importance of coming back to the present moment, and not only the importance like religiously or spiritually in that, but neurologically and retraining the neural pathways in our brains. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I'm very interested in the idea of that kind of practice.
And that's an excellent point. And this book was written before, I think, the term mindfulness was widely used. And I was planning to talk about that too in later classes about, well, what do we do to manage this anxiety? And that's really one of the best ways to well, again, all the research out there on mindfulness and spiritual practice to keep anxiety down and to really focus in the moment. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. Now more than ever is when we need to be not only practicing here and now kinds of exercises, but also our rituals. Rituals that we can still do. And not only theological rituals, even though I think those are very important, but I realized here last week when I felt the most quote unquote normal was when I was sitting snapping beans watching a Perry Mason episode on my iPad. I loved it. That's something I would do anytime. And it doesn't take much. Doesn't take much to get me excited. But that's, I think that we need to be really noticing those things that we do, whether they be spiritual practice or just daily practice that kind of help us, shift our minds away from all this anxiety.
Well, I was just noticing that what you were saying about that, to me, that is mindfulness. If you are mindful of the fact that you're snapping beans
Yes.
and watching Perry Mason,
That's a good, yeah. Some people say with true mindfulness, you're not supposed to do two things at the same time, but
Oh, okay.
still, yes, I
I'm
think
not an
that.
expert.
Fingers can do beans without your brain.
Pardon?
Your fingers can do beans
Yes,
without your
yes,
brain.
yes.
Well, and so ritual, mindfulness, things that people are used to. So then the other thing that is going on in culture is this is a window when things can change. We have this window of opportunity when things can change. Should we change things? So that when people come back, it's not what it was. So, okay, so the men's bathroom downstairs was completely remodeled while we've not been in the building. Okay, that's a change. I don't think anybody's going to be bothered to reuse the nice bathroom. But worship team did talk about some other changes that could happen during this time when we're not in our building. And people were like, whoa, maybe we ought not to do that. Because maybe people need to come back to what they left and not have changes. And yet we've got this wonderful window when they... And schools are in the same boat. I talked to John Hoffman for a while about school starting, and it's, kids, little kids needing what they know they have, and yet there's things in the building that have changed and will probably never go back. And yeah, that's an interesting, what do you go back to?
And I actually wrote that question down in my original notes when I read through this book the first time. And it got me thinking about, is this time in history, with all the upheaval of COVID-19, time to make a change? Because as Kathryn says, yeah, it is an opportunity to, because we're knocked off balance, and sometimes when we're knocked off balance, that can lead to some aha moments that help us make healthy change or useful change. But I think, as I've thought about this question, personally, I think that it's just important to make sure that if we're making change, that it is mindful change, that it is thinking cap change, not some anxious knee-jerk change. Does that make sense? I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
Charlotte, is it possible that we need to get beyond ourselves and see ourselves as a part of the bigger church we may have some things to learn from our brothers and sisters in Nigeria. I mean, we think we got it tough,
Oh, yeah.
duh. And there are other situations in which perhaps the opportunity for us is to begin to realize we are not so unique here as compared to others in the world. And I think the global church has a lot to teach us. And so if we're going to be mindfully making decisions, let us be informed by not only our navel gazing, but by looking and listening.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting at our house, we're baseball fans. And so we've been watching the Royals and they're coming back. So it's interesting because they are, because of COVID, making changes.
Right.
And the talk that you hear is that, this feels pretty good. Yeah, maybe we should do this permanently. And it's interesting to be in, to think about change in this church and the building itself and, how are we going to change things. The advantage that the MLB has is that they can do this publicly. And there's lots of talk about this. What do you think about it? It gives you a chance to think about a doubleheader having 2 7-inning games instead of 2 9-inning games. So we don't get to do that here. We don't get to think, well, what if we do this? Let's talk about that. Let's try it out. We just can't do that. So it just feels a little bit different. And I think in the school it's the same thing. The kids are going to walk in and boom, it's going to all be different. They didn't get to have any part of it.
Well, let's not say that we can't do that.
No, I know.
I mean, maybe we need to be creative and find ways that we can discuss.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a congregational meeting in the lower level of the church on Sunday afternoon. It won't work then. But how else might we have these discussions? Opening it up so people, I'm always saying, well, they never asked me about that.
Yeah.
How can we how can we be creative and find ways that people aren't shocked when they see or a decision is made for a change? They feel like they've had opportunity to think and discuss about it. We need to be creative about all that.
And the genius in the separate but together is in the Church of the Brethren, the blessing is we're all ministers. The curse is we're all ministers. So when we discuss, we have 250 opinions, and everybody's opinion is different, and who ultimately makes the decision for those 250 opinions. So it's a blessing and a curse. How close. I love his phrase in there when he says, are they Bob and Betty, or are they Bob and Betty? And that's a big difference, when it's one word, Bob and Betty, or Bob and Betty, which I think about church.
It seems to me one thing we could do maybe is organize smaller groups so we could have 5 or 6 people in a group. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of us sitting around here saying we'd like to contribute something. When you got about 30 of us, that's tough to do. And maybe that's something we ought to be thinking about. I mean, I've been hearing people saying, this is going to go on for a couple of years, folks. This vaccine talk is not that promising. So I don't think we've wrapped our heads around the possibility that we may be doing this for another 2 years. And to me, that's a big difference in saying, well, I can survive for another 3 or 4 months. This will be all over with. And I don't know how many of us have really internalized that. And part of what Charlotte was saying, what can we do? To me, it just seems like we need to be a community that will listen to people and not be judgmental. And how we can organize that would be, there's small group procedures that allow groups of 5 or 6 people to say, here's your 1 or 2 main thoughts, and then you share that with a larger group, and maybe that'll give us some direction where to go. I don't know.
And I had a conversation yesterday with with Vicki Samland, who, in full disclosure, is Chris's oldest sister, and she was the past moderator of the district. So as district conference has been meeting and assessing how meeting on Zoom went, they are assuming that next summer, we're gonna be in the same boat that we were this summer. So their question is, given that, is this a time for change? Is this not a time for change? If they make change, how much change do they make? How do they make sure they get input from everybody? Those exactly what you're talking about, Bill. That is exactly the conversation. You know, and she was calling to just make sure she understood the McPherson Church's willingness to host or not host in a COVID environment. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's so important to keep in mind individual differences when we think about what we're doing and decision making. For me personally, I feel like I've got so much on my plate that I just, if something's going on around here that I need to know about, I'm assuming somebody will tell me, you know. So it just is really kind of differences in personality and I think life circumstances too that make a difference.
I think it's really me that, is this a good way to go to church?
What?
The way we're doing it now, is this a good way for us as a church? Is this what we should be doing anyway?
Ah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And then we talk about loneliness, and we talk about all the churches in the district. That's a good way to save economic, it makes economic sense. Not to be traveling, it makes environmental sense. But is that really what church is?
I really miss singing together. That article I came across really resonated with me. I mean, that is the spiritual highlight for me of any year is singing at annual conference. You know, we can do all the yammering and fighting and whatever that happens at annual conference. But for me personally, it goes away when we sing together.
It's been my observation that we don't need annual conference. And so not having annual conference creates wrinkles in various ways. But from a theological perspective, a denominational expectation, we don't need to meet. If we need a family reunion, yeah, okay, annually, let's go have a family reunion. But, so I was, I'm not sure what the right word would be, amused, or I told you so, or I was not disappointed that they canceled annual conference, because from my perspective, we don't need annual, we need biannual or quadrannual or something, because of the way things are.
Well, and I think some of that, and there has been discussion, I think, as a denomination about what is the role of annual conference these days. Again, historically, I mean, Carl Loewen, in some of his writings, talks about there was a time in the 1800s where annual conference, I mean, that was, it's theoretically, annual conference is still the final authority of the church, but where annual conference minutes were published and everybody was expected to read it, and, you know, what you did at conference determined where the church was going. It's just not that way anymore. So what is the role of conference? I mean, I hear what you're saying with that.
We are at the top of the hour. You may stay and put your chairs away. If you're staying with Kendra, keep your chair and circle around. And if you're going to visit, go elsewhere so they can go ahead, and we're going to pack up and go to the sanctuary. Thank you all. We will be here next Sunday, and we will be doing chapter 4.